Melissa Montgomery had always believed that her wedding day with Edward Clark would be the happiest moment of her life. Since childhood, she and Edward had been inseparable. He was the boy who once stood up for her against cruel taunts, and she had grown up believing he was the only man worthy of her heart. Their marriage was not only a union of two people but also a grand alliance between the Montgomery and Clark families, celebrated with an opulent ceremony that everyone expected to seal their bond. Yet, just as Melissa stepped down the aisle, everything fell apart. When the officiant was about to begin the vows, Edward suddenly received a phone call. Ruby Blackwell, a poor scholarship student he had long supported, had been in a serious car accident. Without hesitation, Edward abandoned the ceremony, leaving his bride standing under the arch as he rushed to the hospital to be with Ruby. Before the shocked eyes of the guests, Melissa stood frozen in her wedding gown, the delicate white veil suddenly feeling unbearably heavy. The Clark family quickly realized the scandal could jeopardize the alliance they had worked so hard to build. Evelyn Clark, Edward's pragmatic mother, acted swiftly to salvage the situation. She offered Melissa a startling alternative. Instead of Edward, she could choose one of Evelyn's other 3 sons to marry, thereby preserving the bond between the two families. Among the 3, Melissa found herself inexplicably drawn to Bernard Clark. The adopted son of the Clark family, Bernard had grown up in the shadows, enduring years of cold treatment and hardship under their roof. Known for handling the family's covert dealings, he was a man of few words, with a distant gaze that hinted at secrets untold. Amid the chaos of the broken wedding, Melissa made a decision that stunned everyone present. She chose Bernard as her groom. That single choice not only altered the course of her own life but also set into motion a relationship that would prove to be both unconventional and fraught with storms yet to come. Melissa's declaration to marry Bernard instead of Edward struck the Clark family like a thunderbolt. The guests whispered in disbelief, but Melissa's calm, unwavering voice left no room for debate. Bernard, standing a few steps behind the others, looked at her with quiet astonishment, his expression unreadable beneath the dim chandelier light. Though Evelyn Clark forced a polite smile to save face in front of the guests, deep down she could barely conceal her contempt. To her, Bernard was nothing more than a tool, an adopted son raised to serve the family's interests. Even now, as he stood in the tailored suit prepared for Edward, he seemed more like a reluctant stand-in than a groom. That night, the hasty wedding was completed with minimal ceremony. Melissa held her head high as she signed the marriage certificate beside Bernard, while the murmurs of scandal echoed throughout the hall. The Clark family believed she had chosen Bernard out of spite, to humiliate Edward for abandoning her. None of them knew that Melissa had been struck by something deeper in Bernard's distant eyes, a quiet strength wrapped in shadows. When Melissa brought Bernard back to the Montgomery estate, the atmosphere shifted. Her family, though shocked, welcomed him with measured courtesy. Bernard, however, remained silent and reserved, keeping to the edges of the room as though he didn't belong. Late that evening, while unpacking his few belongings, Melissa caught a glimpse of the man beneath the stoic facade. As he slipped off his shirt, the pale light revealed a back covered in faded scars, some long-healed, others raw and recent. Her breath caught at the sight of the jagged lines, the evidence of years of punishment and hardship. She noticed a faint metallic mark at the base of his neck, the remnant of the electronic chip implanted by the Clark family, designed to control him with jolts of pain whenever he disobeyed. For the first time, Melissa's anger toward Edward began to dissolve into something else, pity and a fierce resolve. She approached Bernard gently, offering fresh bandages and ointment. Though he accepted her help in silence, a fleeting softness flickered in his eyes, as if he was unaccustomed to kindness. That night, an unspoken understanding began to grow between them. What had started as a substitute marriage born of humiliation and revenge quietly turned into the first fragile bond between two wounded souls who, despite everything, found a strange sense of calm in each other's presence. The days that followed were marked by an uneasy quiet in the Montgomery estate. Bernard kept mostly to himself, helping around the house in subtle ways, fixing a broken latch on a garden gate, repairing a squeaky door, never asking for acknowledgement. Melissa often watched him from afar, intrigued by the contradiction in his character, a man hardened by hardship yet so naturally attentive to the small details others overlooked. At first, she told herself it was only curiosity. Bernard was unlike any man she had ever known. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, and when he did, his words were brief but steady, carrying a sincerity that lingered. Melissa, who had spent years surrounded by high society's false charm and political games, found his honesty oddly comforting. One rainy evening, Melissa returned late from a business dinner. The storm had knocked out the power in parts of the estate, and the hallways were dimly lit by candlelight. She found Bernard waiting by the front entrance, holding an umbrella, his shirt damp from the rain as if he had been standing there for a while. "You didn't have to wait," she said softly, surprised by his presence. "You shouldn't walk alone in the dark," he replied, his voice low, almost hesitant. Something unspoken shifted between them that night. In the weeks that followed, Melissa noticed Bernard's quiet acts of care, leaving her favorite tea on the veranda before she woke, adjusting the window shutters so the morning sun wouldn't wake her too early, even tending to the roses she loved though his calloused hands were clearly unused to gardening. One night, as autumn winds held outside, Melissa woke from a restless dream and found herself wandering to the balcony. Bernard was already there, leaning against the railing, the moonlight tracing the sharp lines of his face. They spoke little, but in that silence, she felt a strange peace. That evening became the turning point. Drawn by an unexplainable pull, Melissa stepped closer, resting her head lightly against his shoulder. Bernard hesitated, then shifted slightly to shield her from the cold breeze. The warmth of his presence wrapped around her like a promise she hadn't realized she needed. Though neither confessed their feelings, both knew something fragile yet profound had begun to take root, an affection born not from passion or duty, but from shared solitude and unspoken understanding. Edward Clark returned sooner than Melissa expected. His expression was drawn, eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. He arrived unannounced at the Montgomery estate one crisp afternoon, carrying an air of urgency. Melissa was in the garden tending to her roses when she heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. "Melissa," Edward called out, his voice low but edged with desperation. She straightened slowly, meeting his gaze without the warmth she once had for him. "Why are you here, Edward?" He stepped closer, his tone softening. "I came to explain, that day at the wedding, I didn't mean to abandon you. Ruby had been in an accident. She could have died. I couldn't ignore her call for help." Melissa's expression remained calm, almost distant. "And yet, you ignored me, the woman you were about to marry. You didn't even look back." Edward flinched at her words, regret flashing in his eyes. His gaze drifted toward the house, where Bernard appeared in the doorway, silent as ever. Edward's demeanor hardened instantly. "You married him?" Edward's voice dropped, cold with disbelief. "Melissa. Bernard? Of all people?" Melissa said nothing, but the subtle way her eyes softened when she glanced at Bernard was answer enough. Rage simmered beneath Edward's polished exterior. "You don't know what he is," he hissed. "He's not worthy of you. He's nothing but a mutt they dragged in from the streets." "Enough, Edward," Melissa warned, her voice sharp, but Edward pressed on, as if he couldn't stop himself. "Do you even know his past? That he spent his childhood locked in a kennel like an animal? That we had to implant a control chip in his neck because he was too wild, too dangerous to be trusted?" The air grew heavy with silence. Bernard's jaw tightened, but he said nothing, his eyes shadowed by the memory Edward had unearthed. Melissa felt a surge of anger, not at Bernard, but at Edward's cruelty. "Leave," she said at last, her tone steady but laced with ice. "Whatever you think of Bernard, he's my husband now. You lost the right to judge me, or him, the moment you left me at the altar." Edward's expression twisted with fury and regret, but he turned on his heel and left, his parting words unspoken. The encounter left a deeper rift between them, and Melissa's resolve to protect Bernard only strengthened in the aftermath. That night, long after Edward's visit, Melissa sat alone by the window of her bedroom. The moonlight spilled across the floor, stirring memories she had kept buried for years. She remembered the cold darkness of the forest from her childhood, the night she had wandered too far from home and lost her way. In her panic, she had stumbled into an abandoned cave, unaware that it was home to a wolf pack. When rescuers finally found her days later, the frightened villagers whispered that she was cursed, that the wild in her eyes was unnatural. Children in the town called her the girl who belonged to the wolves, a monster to be feared. Edward had been the only one to stand by her then. A boy with kind eyes and a stubborn sense of justice, he had shielded her from the taunts and defended her when others mocked her scars and wild hair. For years, that memory had bound Melissa to him, gratitude entwined with the soft ache of first love. As the daughter of the Montgomery family, Melissa had grown into a strong, capable woman. When the Clark family's finances had teetered on the brink of collapse years ago, it had been she who proposed the marriage alliance, hoping to repay Edward's childhood kindness while saving his family from ruin. She believed their union was built on trust and shared history, but the image of Edward running out of the church on their wedding day replayed endlessly in her mind. The sharp sting of betrayal cut deeper each time she thought of it. The man who once protected her had left her standing alone in front of hundreds of guests, choosing another woman without hesitation. Melissa clenched her fists against the pain. That chapter of her life, the girl who owed Edward everything, was over. She had paid her debts 100-fold. Turning from the window, she caught sight of Bernard's silhouette in the courtyard below, quietly repairing a broken lantern. In that moment, she made her choice. No longer would she live bound by gratitude or the weight of the past. Melissa would cut all ties with Edward, protect Bernard from further harm, and shield the fragile bond they had begun to build. This time, she would fight not out of duty or obligation, but for the man who, despite his scars and silence, had given her a new reason to believe in love. The tension between the Montgomery and Clark families reached its peak when Melissa requested a formal meeting at the Clark estate. The grand dining hall, usually a place of polite business discussions, felt colder that afternoon, its polished marble floors echoing with every step she took. Evelyn Clark sat at the head of the long table, flanked by Edward and the other sons. Bernard stood silently behind Melissa, his presence imposing yet calm, as though prepared for the battle that would unfold. Melissa's voice was steady as she began, her gaze fixed on Evelyn. "I am officially terminating my engagement to Edward. Our marriage alliance will not proceed as planned." Edward's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, Melissa continued, "However, I am willing to maintain the business partnership between our families, on one condition. You will remove the control chip from Bernard." A ripple of disbelief spread through the room. Evelyn's composed facade cracked for the first time. "You have no idea what you're asking," she said coldly. "That chip is there for a reason. Bernard has a dangerous past. Without it, we can't guarantee he won't what?" Melissa interrupted, her tone sharp. "He's a man, not a beast. If you fear him, it's because of the way you've treated him, not because of who he is." Edward leaned forward, his voice edged with frustration. "Melissa, you're letting your emotions cloud your judgment. Bernard was put under control for the safety of everyone here. If you remove that chip," Melissa cut him off again, her voice rising just enough to silence the room. "If you refuse, then the Montgomery family will withdraw all joint ventures. I won't allow Bernard to live like a prisoner under your roof, or under your control." Evelyn's eyes narrowed. It was clear she wanted to refuse, but the weight of the Montgomery partnership was too great to ignore. After a long silence, she finally exhaled. Fine. We'll arrange the removal. But remember, you're responsible for whatever happens after. Melissa's gaze softened slightly as she looked at Bernard, whose expression remained unreadable. The decision had been made, one that would free him from years of pain but also strip away the only restraint the Clark family had placed upon him. As they left the hall together, Melissa felt the shift in power. For the first time, she wasn't merely reacting to the Clark family's choices, she was rewriting the rules. The day of the procedure arrived under a heavy, gray sky that mirrored Melissa's dread. The private medical wing of the Montgomery estate was prepared with state-of-the-art equipment, yet the atmosphere felt more like a battlefield infirmary than a sterile clinic. Bernard sat on the edge of the operating bed, silent as usual, his shirt discarded to reveal the faint metallic scar at the base of his neck where the chip had been implanted. Melissa stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. He didn't look at her, but she felt the tension coiled in his muscles. "Are you ready?" she asked softly, his lips curved faintly, too faint to be called a smile. "I've been ready for years." The surgeon, Dr. Harris, hesitated before beginning. "The chip is fused with nerve tissue. Removing it will be extremely painful and risky. We'll do everything we can, but he needs to stay as still as possible." Bernard merely nodded, refusing the anesthesia that could dull his senses but increase the danger. Melissa wanted to protest, but his resolute gaze silenced her. The procedure began with a low hum of machinery and the sharp scent of antiseptic filling the room. Melissa stood close, refusing to leave his side even when the first incision was made. Bernard's jaw tightened, the muscles in his arms straining as he gripped the edges of the table. Not a single sound escaped his lips, but beads of sweat rolled down his temples. Minutes stretched into hours. The room grew tense as the surgeon worked with painstaking precision to detach the chip's delicate connections from Bernard's spine. Then came a sudden gush of blood. "Clamp. Now." Dr. Harris barked. Melissa's heart lurched as Bernard's face drained of color. His breathing became shallow, his body trembling under the strain. She reached out instinctively, cradling his head against her chest, whispering, "Stay with me, Bernard. Don't you dare leave me now." Finally, with a final tug, the surgeon extracted the small, jagged piece of metal that had ruled Bernard's life for years. But the victory was short-lived. Bernard's eyes fluttered closed, and he collapsed fully into Melissa's arms. For a moment, the room was filled with nothing but the frantic beeping of monitors and Melissa's ragged breathing. As Dr. Harris worked feverishly to stabilize him, Melissa's tears slid silently down her cheeks. Watching Bernard fight for life reignited her resolve. No matter what it cost, she would protect him, from the Clark family, from his past, and from anyone who tried to break him again. Bernard's recovery was slow, marked by fevered nights and a fragile calm during the day. Melissa rarely left his side, watching over him as if her presence alone could shield him from the shadows of his past. One evening, as the rain pattered against the tall windows of the Montgomery estate, Dr. Alex Smith, Melissa's longtime friend and the surgeon who had overseen Bernard's post-operative care, arrived unannounced. He stood at the doorway of Bernard's room, his expression grave. "You're risking too much," Alex said quietly after Bernard had drifted into an uneasy sleep. "Without the chip suppressing him, we don't know what he's capable of. The neural implants controlled his impulses. There's no telling how he'll react now that it's gone." Melissa stiffened, her fingers tightening around the blanket she had been adjusting for Bernard. "He's not dangerous," she replied, her voice firmer than she felt. "You've seen how gentle he's been." Alex shook his head. "Gentleness can be a mask. His records before the chip were classified. That alone should concern you. We don't know who Bernard really is, or what he might remember." That night, as Melissa sat alone in the dimly lit study, the voices returned, the strange, disembodied whispers that had plagued her for months. They were like unseen commentators lurking at the edge of her consciousness. He's not who he seems, one voice hissed. The villain always hides in plain sight, another added, its tone almost mocking. Melissa pressed her palms to her temples, shutting her eyes. You're wrong, she muttered under her breath, as if speaking to the shadows themselves. The voices persisted, weaving doubts into her thoughts. They spoke of hidden bank accounts, of a fortune Bernard might have tucked away under a false identity, of secrets buried so deep even he might have forgotten them. Yet, when Melissa returned to Bernard's bedside and saw the fragile rise and fall of his chest, the memories of his pain during the surgery, she felt her resolve harden. I don't care who he was, she whispered, brushing a damp lock of hair from his forehead. I know who he is now. Ignoring Alex's warnings and the whispers that haunted her mind, Melissa made her choice. She instructed the staff to prepare a guest room for Bernard, though he remained too weak to leave his bed, and vowed to keep him under her protection. In that quiet decision, Melissa placed her trust in her own instincts over the doubts that clawed at her sanity, unaware of how soon the past would come knocking at their door. A week after Bernard's surgery, the tranquility of the Montgomery estate was shattered by the unexpected arrival of Ruby Blackwell. She stepped out of a sleek black car, her porcelain face framed by a silk scarf, her movements slow and delicate as though she were recovering from some lingering illness. Melissa met her in the grand foyer, arms folded, her expression calm but guarded. Ruby's wide, doe-like eyes glistened with unshed tears as she stepped closer. Melissa, I owe you an apology, Ruby said softly, her voice trembling just enough to stir sympathy. I never meant to ruin your wedding. The accident that day, it wasn't my fault. I was in the hospital, fighting for my life. Melissa's lips pressed into a thin line. You didn't ruin the wedding. Edward did when he chose to leave. Ruby lowered her gaze, letting a small sigh escape her. I only came to make things right. I don't want us to be enemies. I'm so grateful for everything Edward has done for me, but I also want to thank you for the years you stood by him. The words sounded sincere, yet Melissa detected a glint of calculation beneath Ruby's feeble smile. Later that evening, Melissa noticed Ruby lingering near the garden where Bernard was seated in a wheelchair, still recovering. Ruby's tone shifted, soft, almost intimate, as she complimented Bernard's resilience, asking gentle questions about his recovery. Bernard, reserved as ever, responded politely but distantly. Melissa's chest tightened as she watched from the balcony above. It wasn't jealousy that stung her, but a sharp intuition. Ruby wasn't here merely to apologize. Meanwhile, Edward made his own attempts to worm his way back into Melissa's good graces. He arrived at the estate the next morning with a bouquet of rare white lilies, the kind Melissa had once adored as a teenager, and an ornate box containing a sapphire bracelet. I know I made mistakes, Edward said, his tone low, almost pleading. I want to make it up to you, Melissa. We could still fix what's broken between us. Melissa didn't flinch as she met his gaze. You're too late, Edward. I'm not the girl who waited for you anymore. The tension between them hung heavy, unspoken but palpable. With Ruby weaving her way into Bernard's orbit and Edward trying to win Melissa back, the fragile peace Melissa had fought to build was already beginning to crack. As the days passed in the Montgomery estate, Melissa found herself increasingly drawn to Bernard. It wasn't just his brooding silence or the mysterious aura that surrounded him, it was the depth of his resilience, the way he carried scars that spoke of pain few could endure, yet still managed to care for others. Every small gesture, from the way he quietly prepared her tea to the way he listened intently when she spoke, made her heart soften. She realized that Bernard was not only a protector but a man who deserved love and understanding, a stark contrast to the arrogance and impulsiveness she had long associated with Edward. Yet, as Melissa's feelings deepened, so too did the complications. Edward, unable to reconcile the fact that Melissa had chosen Bernard over him, grew more desperate. His visits to the estate became increasingly frequent, his apologies laced with subtle accusations, and his gifts more extravagant. He wanted to reclaim the bond he believed was his, but the more he tried, the more Melissa's resolve hardened. Still, Edward's presence was a constant reminder of a past she had once cherished, making it difficult to ignore the lingering echoes of old emotions. Meanwhile, Ruby Blackwell proved far more cunning than her fragile appearance suggested. She lingered around Bernard under the pretense of concern for his health, offering support that seemed innocent to outsiders. But Melissa could sense the calculated effort behind Ruby's soft words and gentle gestures. Ruby sought to embed herself into Bernard's life, testing the limits of Melissa's patience and challenging the fragile peace of the household. Amidst this tangled web of emotions, hidden secrets began to surface. Whispers about Bernard's past, the shadowy origins of his wealth, and the dangerous undertakings he had once been forced into by the Clark family started to leak out. Melissa, caught between the desire to protect Bernard and the fear of the unknown, realized that the stakes were higher than a simple romantic rivalry. The four of them, Melissa, Bernard, Edward, and Ruby, were entangled in a complex dance of desire, jealousy, and ambition, each carrying their own burdens and motivations. As Melissa's affection for Bernard solidified, the tension escalated, promising a storm of confrontation, revelations, and emotional upheaval. The coming days would test loyalties, expose truths long buried, and determine not only who would claim her heart but who would emerge unscathed from the shadows of the past. The battle for love, trust, and control was only just beginning.